Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the latest in our series of ENO Center for Transportation webinars. Today we are presenting equity in ride-hailing services. And to help us understand more about equity and the service provided by taxis and ride-hailing companies like Uber and Lyft, we are happy to be joined today by Dr. Anne Brown. Dr. Brown is an assistant professor at the School of Planning, Public Policy, and Management at the University of Oregon, and she recently completed her dissertation at UCLA entitled Ride-Hail Revolution, Ride-Hail Travel and Equity in Los Angeles. Today she's going to share with us some of the findings from her research, which examine the presence of and types of discrimination in various ride-hail services measured by wait times and cancellations. We will then have plenty of time for questions. Please feel free to enter your questions in the question box at the side of your screen at any time, and we will get to as many as possible after the presentation. We think you'll find this discussion interesting and timely, and thank you all for taking the time to join us today. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Anne.
Great, thanks Alice. Thanks everyone for being here this afternoon. So as Alice mentioned, I'm presenting research that I wrapped up in 2018 on equity and ride-hailing services. So in this research, I had compared taxis to ride-hail services, specifically in Los Angeles. And in case you do have to step out, in a nutshell, I find that there is stark discrimination in taxis. And then when we compare taxis to ride-hail services, there is still some discrimination in ride-hailing, but it dramatically narrows the gap that we still find in taxis themselves. So why did I get into this research to begin with? Well, my research in general focused on transportation equity, and so travelers need occasional access to a car, even those without. And one of the main ways that people have gained access to cars traditionally is through taxis. But taxis have, for many years, had a poor record of discrimination. So either providing poor or no service in low-income neighborhoods or communities of color, and then also discriminating against individuals. So for the past few decades, there have been say police stings in cities around the country that find uneven and unequal access to taxis, particularly by race. So my question was, well, what about these new services? What about ride hailing, which is somewhat a new chapter in this taxi era, so upending the taxi business model, but is it also upending the traditional discrimination we've seen for so many years? So my research question, is there evidence of discrimination in ride-hail and taxi industries? And I answered this through an audit study in Los Angeles. So I'll walk you through how this was set up. So what happened is I hired about 18 UCLA students. They were all between the ages of 20 and 30. They were both men and women and identified as Asian, Hispanic, Black, and white. So I had 4 different racial ethnic groups, both men and women. They were all dressed the same. And they stood on one of 2 different corners to hail Uber, Lyft, and taxis. So what they did was they essentially shuttled between these 2 different locations. So starting at one, they would hail an Uber, Lyft, or taxi, get to the second site, and essentially reverse that trip. What this means is that because we're in just 2 sites, the geography is essentially controlled for. So everything is the exact same, is consistent across the different riders and across the locations. The only thing that varies between these auditors, these riders, is their race, ethnicity, and gender. So these are those variables I wanted to examine. Were we seeing differences in the service people were receiving, specifically the wait times and cancellation rates? And I'll also note that on Uber and Lyft, all of the riders did have 4.5-star ratings or higher. So we also controlled for this question of essentially the public profile of the different riders. The last element that the riders collected for each trip was the driver characteristics. I'm not going to touch on the driver characteristics in the findings because I found that essentially did not make a difference. The findings I'm going to present were consistent no matter the qualities of the drivers, so no matter the race, ethnicity, gender, or age of the drivers. Just keep that in the back of your mind. So I want to present first really quickly just the general patterns of service between taxis and ride-hail services. They're pretty stark differences. I want to start with those. And then I want to get into this question of how did service vary by rider characteristic and what differences did I observe? So first, Cancellations. So there's really stark differences between ride-hail services and taxis. And the implications for mobility are even greater. So 1 in 5 taxi trips were canceled during these times. And these two sites are, for those familiar with Los Angeles, were in Culver City and then about 2 miles east, both along the new Expo line. And for those not as familiar with Los Angeles, these are pretty central, dense neighborhoods. They're places we would expect to be able to get robust taxi, Uber, and Lyft service, not at all suburban or remote. And so 1 in 5 taxis were canceled. So this could occur a variety of ways. It occurred when riders waited more than 60 minutes and no taxi showed up. It occurred when a taxi approached a rider and then drove off. It occurred when they called a taxi dispatch on the phone and the taxi dispatcher informed them that no taxis were available. So a variety of ways. Cancellations on Uber and Lyft are quite different. So if any of you have taken Uber and Lyft, I imagine this has happened to you. It certainly happened to me as well, which is that if you're assigned a driver, then the app will tell you the driver is no longer available, and you'll be put back into that rider pool waiting to be assigned a new driver. So the reason I want to highlight these cancellations is that they have really stark differences for mobility. So with taxis, when 20% are canceled, that means that only 80%, so 4 out of 5 riders actually get picked up in the end. On Uber and Lyft, because the cancellations result in just being assigned a new driver, almost every single rider was still picked up. So for the cancellations, implications for mobility are quite different for the two services. Arrival times also varied dramatically between taxis and Uber and Lyft, and keeping in mind, again, these are central locations in Los Angeles. So this graph shows the distribution of wait times. And I should have mentioned that the data were collected 7 days a week, so Sunday through Saturday, 9 a.m. to 9 p.m. And these are the distribution across those whole times. So you'll see that about 90% of Uber and Lyft trips arrived under 10 minutes. And that includes the peak of the peak in LA traffic. Taxis were remarkably less reliable and slower as well. So about a little over a third arrived in under 10 minutes. And you can see this long tail distribution of taxis slowly arriving in that course of an hour. And I want to remind you that there were those taxis that were canceled because they didn't show up in an hour. So about 10% of all taxis hailed did not arrive within 60 minutes. And so this is a distribution showing all of the trips that we collected. There were about 1,700 trips total that were taken over the course of this study. So quite a robust sample to analyze these trends. So I want to talk now about how did cancellations and wait times vary across the different riders. So I want to take a minute to introduce this graph, because I'm going to present a few of them. So what this shows is cancellation rates, and the different bars represent the different services. So taxis are in yellow, and then Uber is in the dark gray, and Lyft is in the light gray. The black lines across each bar represent the 95% confidence intervals. So any one that has a confidence interval that crosses 0 is effectively, there's no difference, so it's effectively 0. So what this graph shows, starting out, is that I observed no differences between white, Asian, and Hispanic riders in terms of cancellations. And no differences between men and women. But I found that there were 26, over a quarter of taxi trips hailed by Black riders were canceled. And that's compared to about 15% of taxi trips by white riders and 20% by Asian and Hispanic riders, which means that Black riders were 73% more likely to have a taxi cancel than white riders. So a dramatic difference. By contrast, Uber and Lyft was about a 4% difference. So there still was a difference, but it was far, far narrower between Black and white riders compared to the taxi services. Total wait times, we observed similar trends. So no differences between white, Asian, and Hispanic riders. No difference between men and women. But between Black and white riders, Black riders waited far longer than white riders on average. So on taxis, controlling for time of day and the taxi company, Black riders waited between about 7 and about 15 minutes longer than a white rider. On Uber and Lyft, this was about 11 seconds to about 1:43 seconds longer. And I want to highlight again this taxi piece. So the average wait time on Uber and Lyft was about 6 minutes. So what this effectively means is that 2 riders could stand next to each other on a corner, one white rider, one Black rider. if they hailed a taxi the exact same moment and a white rider's taxi arrived, a black rider statistically could expect to get a ride faster if they waited for the white rider's taxi to arrive and then hailed an Uber and Lyft or Lyft. That Uber and Lyft would statistically arrive before their taxi that they had originally hailed. So it's really remarkable in the differences we're observing. So a couple policies I want to wrap up with, and then we have lots of time for questions. So first, policies to reduce discrimination and extend access. So quite a few options for reducing discrimination on these platforms. There are platform level potentials, so this could include a variety of options such as on Uber and Lyft, delaying when information is provided to the drivers, could also result in actually tracking driver behavior and seeing if there are systemic issues among especially certain drivers and identifying the problems at the source. Could also be incentivizing reduced cancellation rates, for example. But there's also, of course, a role for policy. So this was a simple audit study. It's easily replicable. It is relatively expensive, so it depends on certainly the resources of the city. But it also could be a role for big data. So, for example, Uber and Lyft have all of these micro data down to essentially the nanosecond. So if collecting rider information and driver information could actually track these at a much broader scale than even we did here. At a taxi level, there are some audits in place, but the repercussions for taxis, although on the books, are not always carried out. So quite a few things to be done to reduce discrimination and extend access on both platforms. But again, the main finding here is really that taxis still have rampant discrimination, particularly against Black riders, and that on Uber and Lyft, their discrimination still is present, but it's far, far less, and the gap between Black and white riders is far narrower than we observed on taxis. So with that, thank you, and I'm looking forward to questions.
Great, thank you, Anne. We've already got a bunch of questions going in. Just a reminder, you can enter questions in the question box on the side of your screen if you haven't already. And also note that we will be uploading a video of the webinar with the slides to our website that you'll be able to access after the webinar for all of you asking about slides. Anne, can we start out actually just with some basic questions more about your research design? How did the taxi drivers know the race of the rider, and actually the ride-hail drivers also? Was that through photos or other information, or?
So it depends. It's a good question. They're all set up slightly differently. So for taxis, the riders were all calling dispatchers, and in that process, they're providing names to the dispatcher, and they also are speaking to them. So there's kind of that moment of knowledge. So mostly it's based on the name. So are people making essentially inferences about race, ethnicity based on names? The other point on taxis where the discrimination can occur is when the taxi actually approaches a rider, right? So, and any of these, they can see the rider themselves. In taxi cases, there were a number of times that the taxi approached riders, and specifically Black riders, and then drove off. There were other cases that, for example, the taxi driver refused to allow the rider, and this only happened to my Black riders, refused to allow them to pay with a credit card. And so this goes against the taxi rider Bill of Rights. So that's an illegal ask. On Uber and Lyft, it's slightly different, and actually they're themselves different. So Lyft shows the picture and name of a rider before a driver accepts a trip. On Uber, they see only the star rating before they accept a trip, and then they're shown a name only afterwards. So a lot of the inferences come from the name piece. And what you can actually see is by looking at the different buckets of wait time, so there's this pre-assignment wait time before riders are assigned to drivers. Those are longer for Lyft than for Uber. And there's more of a gap between Black and white riders on Lyft, where people can see the picture and the name before acceptance. And then on Uber, we're seeing bigger cancellation rates. So basically, as soon as that name is shared with drivers, some drivers are dropping riders, and they're dropping Black riders at higher rates than white riders. There's a couple different points along the way which we observe discrimination.
Thank you. And did you guys look at all at the race of the drivers and if there was any difference in terms of what types of drivers were canceling on what types of riders?
Yeah, I did. So my initial models ran and included the race, ethnicity, and gender of drivers as well. And basically, I found there was no effect of driver characteristics on the discrimination that was occurring. So in other words, it didn't matter who the driver was, the discrimination effect was the same. And that's actually what we'd expect from discrimination findings in other fields.
Got it. And did you look also at location-based discrimination in terms of both cancellations and wait times, in terms of it mattered in terms of like land use or certain neighborhoods?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So this study was really designed around just looking at individual characteristics. And so one of the reasons that I opted to do only 2 locations was really to control for that built environment, so that basically if we assume everything is equal between 2 individuals, and that, even if there's differences between 2 neighborhoods and one neighborhood has slower wait times, higher cancellation rates, those cancellation and wait times should be the same for all riders hailing from that same location, right? So I didn't test many different environments intentionally because I wanted to hone in on this individual characteristic element. But I will note that the 2 neighborhoods I did choose for the study were quite different. So the downtown Culver City Station location is majority white, higher income. And the other location is at the La Brea Expo Line Station, for those of you familiar with Los Angeles, and is on the border of 2 different neighborhoods, one majority Black and one majority Hispanic. So I was able to quasi-test this with just at least the 2 locations. And granted, we had about 800 observations at each location. And I didn't find any difference in the cancellations or wait times between those 2. Again, they're about 2 miles apart, but have quite different characteristics of the neighborhoods themselves.
Yeah, interesting. Did you include in your research any background research on the discrimination training or information that's made available to Uber and Lyft and taxi drivers? And can you tell us a little bit about what you learned or what the differences might be if you did?
So I didn't include anything about the specific training that people are receiving, partly because it's changing so much, at least in the ride-hailing fields. These services move about a mile a minute. So taxis they actually lay out, and Uber and Lyft do as well in their driver code of conduct, that it's not acceptable to discriminate based on any protected class. And taxis specifically in their laws, so essentially being licensed as a taxi driver, are subject to termination if they are found to discriminate. How often that actually happens, I can't speak to that. Certainly not happening as often as we're observing discrimination.
Yeah. Here's an interesting one moving beyond your research. Since you've finished and published your research, what kinds of conversations or responses have you seen from Uber and Lyft and taxi companies to what you found?
Yeah, good question. So Uber and Lyft were very concerned with the findings. So they have said they're going to look into this. I don't know beyond that what concrete actions they've taken. I've had some discussions with them about ideas, but beyond that, I'm not sure the concrete steps. And taxis, so I presented this research to the LA Taxi Cab Commission, and there were quite different responses overall. A lot of the taxi drivers were not particularly receptive to my findings, not surprisingly. The Taxi Cab Commission themselves were a bit more split down the middle in terms of their level of concern. Many were very disturbed by the findings and said they would be following up as well. But again, although they're now aware of these, I'm not aware of concrete steps. And granted, this is still, I presented this research to them last summer, so it hasn't been too long. I mean, there's been months, but things sometimes move slowly on the commission side.
Yeah. Did you take into account, or do you think it matters that the cancellation policies with Uber and Lyft, there's a fee associated to the driver for that, and with the taxi company, do you know, is it a comparable amount or not? And do you think this could have a role in rates that you see as well?
I don't believe there's any punishment for taxis. And in fact, what is interesting is that when I observed cancellation rates in taxis, the cancellation rates I observed are far higher than those reported by LADOT. And I think one of the reasons for that is that when you look at LADOT data, they report a really high rate of no-show taxi passengers. So in other words, a taxi goes to where they were supposed to pick up a rider, and they report that no rider was there. There's no way to verify that, first of all, that no rider was there. And there's also no way to see when did they arrive. And so I mentioned that 10% of the taxi hails didn't show up within 1 hour. So if the taxi's arriving 2 hours after they were called, it's perhaps not surprising that a passenger would no longer be waiting at a location. Say they were standing on a street corner and they've potentially found another way or called a different service, for example. On Uber and Lyft, there's also research from the Airbnb world, for example, so other digital platforms, suggesting in general that ratings have a really strong, both deterrent for poor behavior, so for, say, discriminating, and also can provide essentially a vetting system. So people often will discriminate based on essentially statistics. So they'll say, for example, one thing I heard from the taxi drivers was one of the primary reasons they said they would not pick up Black riders is because they feared fare evasion. So they're using people's race essentially as a proxy for some other behavior that they can't observe. And so with rating, you're essentially removing that inclination to use something that's visible. You have another point of data to go on. So that's another piece of the potential why the discrimination is lower on Uber and Lyft.
And that's one way that we're seeing new technologies in transportation potentially be able to address some equity issues that we've historically had.
Right. Although I will note that it's possible also that star ratings, for example, and this could go both for the riders and the driver side, are also potentially discriminatory, right? So they themselves are skewed. We see this in the service industry. There's actually a lawsuit up in Boston about ride-hail star ratings being biased. And so it's certainly not perfect, and more would need to be looked into about that potential. But compared to the status quo, it's certainly proved far more equitable.
Yep. Moving actually in that same direction of technology's impact on ride hailing, do you have any thoughts about how automated vehicles might play a role in discrimination in the future of ride-hail services? Do you think that will make a difference?
I think it's a maybe question. So, people write algorithms, and so I think one of the roles the public sector should likely be having is to monitor service to ensure that discrimination isn't occurring. And because what I can imagine happening, for example, is if an AV, for example, has in its algorithm something about what is the likelihood that I will be, damaged, for example, what is the danger to my AV body potential? And if it bases that on, say, crime statistics in certain neighborhoods, it could mean that service is actually going to be worse in certain neighborhoods, and potentially neighborhoods that actually need the access the most. And so I think there's a strong role here for the public side to ensure that we don't perpetuate a lot of the existing inequities we've had in our transportation system moving forward.
Yep. There's a whole bunch of questions here about people with disabilities, either people who are wheelchair users or people with visual disabilities. It doesn't look like that was a factor that you included in your study, but do you have any ideas about what kinds of discrimination we're seeing in different types of ride-hailing services with people with disabilities?
Yeah, I didn't look into that for this study. It was trying to keep this one relatively narrow and focus on the race, ethnicity, gender piece. But it's a great question. I can't speak specifically to the discrimination side of it, but in general, wheelchair accessible vehicles, including in ride hailing, are certainly not not particularly robust. And so I think there's a great potential for ride hailing to, say, partner with paratransit services and increase access. So for example, wheelchair accessible vehicles are limited. And so the wait times for those can be really long. Sometimes you often have to make reservations in advance. And so one of the questions is both, can we say if you have someone who has a cane, can they take a sedan that's not wheelchair accessible, and the wheelchair accessible vehicle can be reserved for wheelchair users. So there's some potential there. I will say though, there's a lot of also potential for thinking about what's ride hailing's role, right? So for many years, the companies have argued that they're technology companies, but cities have started taxing them, for example, to say, no, we need wheelchair accessible services as well. So it's a question that's outstanding, and I think certainly demands quite a bit more of attention.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I'm not aware of any large-scale studies on that out yet either,
no,
but...
And one of the reasons, so I was working with some researchers to start looking into that. One of the reasons that's so challenging is it's really hard from a university researcher perspective in terms of human subjects testing. It's just a really sensitive group.
Interesting.
To research on, yeah.
Yeah. Well, I think that's a great area for further research, which brings me to another question. What do you see as the next research steps now that you've completed this very large project? Are you going to continue in the area, or what recommendations would you have for other researchers to build off of your research?
Yes, I have lots of plans, always more ideas. So I've been running with a few different ideas, mostly in the all in the equity and transportation side. With ride hailing specifically, the thing I would encourage is collecting our own data. So my hope is that as time goes on, cities and researchers will become more frequent recipients of ride hail data, or be required to be given ride hail data, for example. But in the meantime, there's a lot of fruitful findings we can have from field observations and experiments. So one of my next questions, which I have to find funding for, is speaking to one of the previous questions, which is how does service vary across neighborhoods? So in that case, you would take, for example, say all riders who share similar characteristics, or maybe just black and just white riders, for example, to look if there's a dimension across race and interaction with the built environment, and test along many different types of environments. I will say that there's been some research on the question of geography of access and equity using from Seattle, using the Uber and Lyft pinging their app essentially. And so there are other ways, and some creative ways, especially with big data now, that we can start answering some really interesting questions.
Great. Well, I'm looking forward to continuing to follow your research. And thank you so much for joining us, and thank everybody else for your participation. We are already at 4:30. ENO is always engaged in these issues around new mobility, involving ride-hail options, issues around equity and transportation, et cetera. And in order to stay up to date and informed, we encourage you to continue tuning into our webinar series and to subscribe to ENO Transportation Weekly, an invaluable resource on all aspects of transportation policy and practice. And you can learn more and sign up on our website, enotrans.org. There were a whole lot of questions we did not get to today on the webinar. We are going to post some links up with the webinar video to some short articles. And maybe, Anne, can we link to your whole dissertation also?
For sure.
Yeah, great. So there's lots of detail in there for those nitty-gritty questions that we weren't able to get to today. I'd encourage you to dive into some of that reading. And again, thank you everybody for joining and for your participation. Thank you so much, Anne, for sharing your research with us. Have a great afternoon.